Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a really an alarming set of data coming out of Hollywood. Every year, we sort of look at the industry's report card, the metrics they use to track inclusion across gender, race, ethnicity. And for the longest time, it felt like those numbers were, well, they were at least inching up, slowly, but suggesting some kind of progress. But the latest report from the USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative has just delivered a shock.
It really has. I mean, it's more than just a critical report. The author and founder of the initiative, Dr. Stacy L. Smith, has actually labeled the findings for 2025 a Great Recession for women directors. And that phrase alone, Great Recession, tells you just how dramatic this reversal is. It's a steep, sudden drop-off. It suggests that the gains Hollywood was celebrating in previous years were, and this is a quote from the source, fundamentally fleeting.
Fleeting. That's a powerful word. So this isn't just about a single bad year's data. It seems to challenge the very foundation of how these studios operate. And here's where we really need to start our deep dive. Before we even look at the, frankly, terrifying numbers, the source material kind of forces us to ask this fundamental question. And it's a question for you, the listener. Does the identity of a film's director actually matter to the average moviegoer?
It's the perfect place to begin because it immediately strips away all the industry's internal politics. Think about it. When you sit down in a theater or on your couch, you're just looking for quality, for execution. The experience itself is universal. And the source gives this fantastic anecdote about the director of a lot of seminal X-Files episodes, a man named Kim Manners.
Oh yeah, that name, Kim Manners, anyone who loved that show will know it instantly. He directed some of the absolute best, most revered hours of television.
Exactly. And for years, millions of people watched his work, critically acclaimed, intense, scary episodes, without knowing or, frankly, caring that he was a man. They were just responding to the quality, to the suspense, the storytelling. The entertainment value stood completely on its own, independent of the director's identity. And the source uses this to underscore that, at the end of the day, what matters to the consumer is the merit of the product.
But inside the executive suites in Hollywood, it's a different story. Identity politics, inclusion metric, those have become central to how success is defined, measured, and maybe more importantly, how the industry gets publicly critiqued, which is where the USC Annenberg Inclusion, and they are, for all intents and purposes, the official auditors. They review the output, and they critique Hollywood's stated...
That's precisely right. This report is titled Inclusion in the Director's Chair, and this is its 7th iteration, so it's a very well-established, highly anticipated document every year. And this is not a lightweight survey either. The scope is incredibly broad.
How broad are we talking?
Well, it focuses specifically on the gender, race, and ethnicity of directors across the 100 top-grossing films of 2025 at the U.S. box office. But that's just a snapshot. The really valuable part is the historical context. They survey trends across a massive set of 1,900 films, and that's released over a 19-year span, running all the way from 2007 through 2025.
Wow. Okay, so that 19-year span, 2007 to 2025, you can't overstate the significance of that. That window covers what? The 2008 financial crash, the peak of superhero dominance, the rise of the streaming wars, huge political shifts. If we're seeing a regression back to 2008 levels now, after almost 2 decades of effort and conversation, it suggests the inclusion efforts not...
That is the essential insight right there. I've seen enough peaks and valleys in the industry to understand that real progress should be resilient. But instead, we have this headline shock from the 2025 snapshot, which is, it's truly devastating for inclusion advocates.
Okay, lay the raw data on us. What did the USC Annenberg Initiative find for less?
The main finding is that women directors made up only 8% of the year's top 100 grossing films. The report noted that there were 111 directors attached to those 100 films, and just 9 of those directors were women.
8%. That figure is so low, it feels almost statistically negligible, in the context of a 50-50 population.
And it's the reversal that makes this a crisis for the industry. In 2024, the percentage of women directors on this same list was 13.4. That was 15 directors. So the 2025 figure means the industry almost cut the number of women directors in half year over year. They didn't just stall, they slammed on the brakes and went to reverse.
And that 2025 figure, that 8.1%, that's the historical echo that the source keeps stressing, right? If we look back across those 90 data, where does 8.1% land us?
It lands us exactly where we were way back in 2008. After nearly 2 decades, Hollywood has essentially erased its own reported progress. It's returned to the level of inclusion, or I guess exclusion, that we saw before. The big corporate push for diversity really began in earnest. The progress was, just as they said, fleeting.
It's a frustrating and alarming cycle. And if you take that 8.1% figure and you calculate the raw imbalance, it clarifies why they're calling this a recession.
It translates to a staggering ratio.
Yeah.
For every one woman director helming a top 100 grossing film in 2025, there were 11.3 men. This kind of numerical disparity is exactly why Dr. Smith and her team felt they had to use that highly provocative, financially charged phrase, Great Recession. This is not a slight dip. This is a market collapse for a specific group of creators.
Okay, that brings us right to the Great Recession label itself. Let's unpack that in a bit more detail because Dr. Smith, as the study's founder, clearly wanted that phrase to set off alarm bells. She said the 2025 data reveals the process for women directors has been fleeting.
Yeah, and that word fleeting is just so crucial. It suggests that the inclusion bump we saw around, say, 2020 to 2024 wasn't the result of studios building deep, sustainable career pipelines, identifying talent, funding their second features, mentoring them up into blockbusters. Instead, it looks more like a temporary reactive surge. Maybe it was designed to alleviate some external political or social pressure, which was then immediately reversed the second executive priority shifted.
And when you have numbers this low, it feels abstract. We need to ground this data in the actual work being done. Of those 111 directors, only 9 were women. We have to make this concrete. Who were they, and what were the films that landed them on that top one?
Absolutely. The list for 2025, it's a mix of some highly established names, successful genre movies, and a lot of franchise work. First, you have Chloe Zhao, who is an established Oscar winner. She directed a film called Hamnet. Then there's Celine Song, who directed The Materialist. You've got Emma Tammy, who's known for directing that huge horror game adaptation, Five Nights at Freddy's. Nisha Ganatra, she helmed the franchise entry Freakier Friday. Maggie Kang directed a critically beloved animated film, K-pop Demon Hunter. The source specifically notes this one was a major hit that people loved, so she should be a priority for future work. There's also Hikari, who directed The Rental Family. Jennifer Caton Robinson directed another franchise entry, I Know What You Did Last Summer. And finally, in the animated category, you have co-directors Madeline Sharafian and Doi for the Disney Pixar film, Elio.
Looking at that list, you immediately see this tension between critical success, financial success, and just plain franchise necessity. The financial stakes are what ultimately put them on the top 100 list, not necessarily the critical.
Right, and the source material highlights 2 specific examples of this misalignment. Take I Know What You Did Last Summer, the franchise entry directed by Jennifer Caton Robinson. It was critically panned. The source didn't mince words. It called the movie off. But because it was a known franchise and it performed well enough financially to get into the top 100, the director made the list.
So she's considered a successful director for the purposes of this study because she hit a financial benchmark with a critically deficient product.
Exactly. And then conversely, you have the Disney Pixar entry, Elio. It also made the list, but while it made money, Dr. Smith and her team noted that it significantly underperformed relative to the immense production and marketing costs that a typical Disney Pixar movie should generate. So you have one success based on critical failure and another success that's really a financial underperformance relative to its own budget.
That underperformance relative to expectation, that seems to be the real career killer in Hollywood. And that brings up this fascinating and maybe slightly harsh comparison the source makes about Emma Tammy, the director of Five Nights at Freddy's.
Yes, Tammy's first film was a huge commercial success, which is what got her on the 2025 list. But the source mentions the sort of industry whispers about the anticipated sequel being awful, this fear of the sophomore slump, or maybe the third act collapse. It drew a direct parallel to the experience of Patty Jenkins.
Right. Jenkins, of course, directed the universally beloved Wonder Woman back in 2017.
Exactly. And she was celebrated for it. But when she came back for the sequel, Wonder Woman 1984, with vastly more creative freedom, critics widely claimed the film just went off the rail. The source posits that this situation where a director gets more freedom and the result is creatively mixed is exactly what executives use to justify their risk aversion. The question becomes, did the director fail? Or did the studio learn the wrong lesson? And they often conclude, we just can't trust an unproven variable with $200 million in creative autonomy.
It really feels like women directors are judged on a much steeper curve. A male director can make an Eternals or a WW84 and often walk away to direct the next massive franchise film, whereas a woman director making one perceived misstep can derail her entire career trajectory.
That is the tightrope they walk, especially when they're given these huge multi-million-dollar budgets. One perceived failure is often viewed by these risk-averse executives, not as an isolated incident, but as confirmation of a pre-existing bias that women directors are just a higher financial risk. And this lack of forgiveness, it ties directly into the next piece of data, the lack of repeat success.
Right. For a director to be considered a safe bet for a massive blockbuster, they need a track record. What do the numbers say about women who have managed to build sustained careers in that top 100 bracket over the 19-year study?
The figures are they're damning. Between 2007 and 2025, only 21 women helmed 2 top-grossing 21 women over 19. That shows an industry that hires women for one opportunity, maybe as a response to pressure or a clear IP fit, but then fails to consistently promote them to a second or third major project.
And if we look specifically at that 2025 group of 9 women directors, were they repeat performers or were they all new?
The majority were newcomers to this high-grossing list. Only 3 of the 9 women in the 2025 sample, Celine Song, Chloe Zhao, and Emma Tammy, had previously directed a film in the study's 19-year sample before 2025. That means 6 of the 9 were getting their first shot at a top 100 film just this past year. It's incredibly hard to build a career when you're constantly filling the pipeline with new, unproven talent instead of promoting proven talent.
So the industry isn't sustaining careers, it's just providing these one-off opportunities. What about the few who have achieved that? Who are the women whose resumes are, as the source puts it, bullet?
The directors who have consistently delivered multiple top-grossing films between 2007 and 2025, they provide that crucial benchmark for what a sustained career looks like. And it's a very short list. It includes Anne Fletcher with 4 films in the sample, Lana Wachowski, also with 4 films, and critically, Greta Gerwig, who has 3 films.
Greta Gerwig's inclusion is incredibly relevant, right? Largely because of her 2023 success with Barbie.
Absolutely. The source notes that Barbie wasn't just a successful film. It was a cultural and commercial phenomenon. It resonated with millions of people globally, and it made massive, reliable money. That is the kind of undeniable, unassailable box office success that, in theory, should instantly secure a director's status and future employment. It should override any executive risk calculation.
And her success really raises the question. If that level of financial and critical success doesn't instantly translate into a decade of guaranteed work, then what hope is there for the others?
That is the anxiety hanging over this entire study. If a director needs to achieve a multi-billion-dollar, once-in-a-generation success just to be treated equally to a male counterpart who had a mediocre, slightly profitable franchise movie, the standard is just impossibly high.
Okay, let's transition now and apply the same lens to the intersections of race and gender, because while the overall numbers for women directors crashed, the dynamics with women of color reveal a fascinating and, well, a frustrating contradiction.
If we look first at the overall picture for all directors, regardless of gender, in 2025, the picture for people of color isn't quite as regressive. Directors from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups made up 24.3% of the total directors. This is basically unchanged from 2024, which was 24.1%, and it's significantly higher than the 12% reported way back 2007. So some inclusion gains have been made structurally for racial diversity in general, which primarily benefits men of color and, as we'll see, some women.
But when you focus specifically on that intersection, women of color, the numbers just plunge right back into that minuscule territory.
Drastic. Only 5.4% of directors in 2025 were women of color. That totals just 6 women across all top 100 films. However, 2025 does mark a notable historical first for the study. The number of women of color, which was 6, actually outnumbered the number of white women, which was 3, directing top-grossing films that year.
That's a truly surprising internal shift within such a small pool. It suggests that while white women directors saw the steepest part of this recession, the tiny gains that were made were concentrated among women of color. But what was the ethnic breakdown of those 6 women of color directors?
And here is where the specificity of the exclusion becomes so clear. All 6 of those women of color directors were Asian. The source emphatically stresses the complete exclusion of other groups. None of the top-grossing films were directed by Black, Hispanic, Latina, Native American, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, or Middle Eastern, North African women directors.
So the already small gains in inclusion are incredibly narrow in scope. We're looking at 6 Asian women directors, 3 white women directors, and absolute 0 representation for the vast majority of other non-white.
And if we take the long view, across that entire 19-year study span from 2007 through 2025, the marginalization of women of color is just undeniable. They still represent only 1.9% of all top-grossing movie directors across 2 decades of data.
It's an unbelievably low number, especially when you juxtapose it with the key finding the study makes about the critical quality of the films directed by. This feels like the real bombshell of the report.
It is the most compelling contradiction. The data from the USC Annenberg Initiative shows that films directed by women of color earn the highest average and median Metacritic score, and that's compared to white male directors, white women, and men of color.
Wait, hold on. If films directed by women of color are demonstrably the highest quality, according to critics and reviewers, which is what Metacritic tracks, why are they the least hired? This completely cuts against the narrative that Hollywood values critical quality.
That is the core cognitive dissonance of this whole thing. The source analysis concludes that if hiring decisions were based solely on performance, using critical merit as the standard, women of color would receive significantly, overwhelmingly more opportunity. The current reality, however, is that this high quality is, and I quote, not only overlooked, it's actively ignored.
When high critical quality is actively ignored, it tells us that executives must be prioritizing something higher. What they are signaling is that quality is a secondary concern to financial, and that's an executive, not an artist.
Exactly. If executives were truly seeking the best possible directors based on critical performance, this data would compel them to hire women of color at significantly higher rate, but they aren't. They're demonstrating that their metric for success is something.
Which leads us perfectly into our next section, explaining those executive decisions. If it's not quality driving this hiring, and it's not just inherent bias, what are the high-level decision makers act?
Well, first, Dr. Smith is very specific about debunking some of the easy political scapegoats. She stresses that the 2025 results are not due to political shifts or recent changes in DEI policy across the U.S.
And why is that distinction so important? Because we often hear claims that DEI initiatives are being dismantled, and that's having a chilling effect.
It's important because of the timeline. Feature films have a long gestation period. The films released in 2025 were greenlit, funded, and often in pre-production long before the 2024 election cycle, and long before any of those associated DEI policy changes could have taken material effect. Dr. Smith explicitly states that this massive decline is driven by executive decision-making that took place much earlier in the production pipe. This is a corporate internal failure. It's not an external political.
Okay, so if it's executive decision-making, it has to come down to the fundamental motivator and turn on an ROI.
Precisely. The central argument about merit and opportunity is that Hollywood studios are increasingly run by what the source calls tech bros and finance guys. These individuals come from backgrounds where every single asset must demonstrate guaranteed high performance. Their singular overriding priority is the return on investment.
And we're not talking about small art house films here. We're talking about the top 100 grossing films. These are often multi-million, sometimes million-dollar productions.
Right. And when you invest $200 million into a tentpole blockbuster, you are not aiming for a small profit or even just breaking even. The profit margin required to satisfy investors, shareholders, hedge funds, it's immense. The risk is simply too high to gamble on an unknown quantity.
So critical acclaim, those high Metacritic scores that women of color are earning, that's essentially irrelevant when you're trying to guarantee a $500 million return on a $200 million investment.
In the eyes of these finance-driven executives, yes. The source is very blunt about this. Critical acclaim doesn't keep you warm at night, and it doesn't pay the bills. If a film is critically adored but fails to generate massive box office returns, the director is immediately flagged as a high-risk variable for the next project. They need massive, reliable, guaranteed box office.
And who is the ultimate gold standard model of that reliable financial success that executives are desperately trying to clone?
The standard, the one who is considered the ultimate financial asset, is James Cameron. The source highlights that his last 4 movies have all made $1 billion or more at the box office. That level of consistent, guaranteed global financial success makes a director above reproach in the studio system. Executives look at that track record and they say, we need that financial predictability.
This inherent risk aversion brings up that philosophical debate that's kind of embedded in the source material. The controversy of true merit versus mandated inclusion. You know, if a spot is gained primarily through a DEI mandate or target, does it carry the same weight as a spot earned purely through performance?
The source argues pretty strongly for meritocracy as the single guiding factor for hiring. The position is that Hollywood should fundamentally return to a meritocratic world, a world where a resume is so objectively bulletproof based on results like Bigelow's or Gerwig, that continued work is guaranteed. The implication is that a reliance on mandated inclusion systems, in the long run, may not build a director's career sustainability in the same way pure financial success does.
Let's talk about the ultimate example of unquestioned merit, according to Catherine Bigelow.
Right. Bigelow, who directed these seminal massive budget successes like Zero Dark 30 and Point Break, she's cited because her career flourished long before identity politics became the mainstream concern it is today. Her hiring was purely based on the quality and success of her work. She's seen as above reproach because her abilities were proven by undeniable box office and critical results. Independent of any external pressures for inclusion, she proved her ROI.
But the reality on the ground often looks like a misalignment with merit, which can lead to some really questionable decisions for both men and the hypothetical case study of Chloe Zhao's possible continued involvement in the MCU highlights this perfectly.
It really does. The Marvel actor Simu Liu publicly suggested that Zhao should direct Shang-Chi 2. However, the source we're looking at strongly criticized this suggestion, and it cited her previous MCU.
And the critique of Eternals from the source material was particularly harsh.
It was. Yeah, referencing the general critical consensus, the source did not pull punches. It said Eternals was poorly paced and garbage, even comparing it to taking Valium because of how slow it was. So if the director's last mega-franchise film was perceived as a creative and financial disappointment, advocating for them to direct the sequel to another highly successful franchise film, like Shang-Chi 1, it raises these massive questions about merit.
Right. Why would someone advocate for her return to a high-stakes franchise when her last effort was considered such a major?
And this is where that perceived lack of consistent merit-based hiring comes into play. If the executive's goal is pure ROI, and Shang-Chi 1 was considered the best of the Phase 4 movies, which it was by many critics. The logical, meritocratic choice would be to hire the original proven director back. The suggestion to hire a director who, according to the source's analysis, failed upward with a previous film, suggests that non-merit factors, whether they're political, relational, or just internal studio dynamics, are at play in these high-level decisions.
It makes you wonder how much failing upward is happening in the industry across the board, regardless of identity. Are male directors surviving the same mistakes that are crushing the careers of their female counterparts?
The source really applies that critique universally. It argues that both men and women need to be hired based on their performance and their proven ability to deliver quality and profitability. Not simply because they were given an opportunity and must be promoted. When executives see one critical failure from a woman director, and then the next round of hiring shows an 8% inclusion rate, it suggests that the failure wasn't treated as an isolated incident, but rather as a universal cautionary tale.
And that structural imbalance in executive risk assessment is precisely what we need to examine next. Let's transition into Section 5, contextualizing Hollywood's hiring patterns by comparing the feature film world to other successful formats. The stark difference in opportunity here is incredibly...
Yeah, when you look outside of the high-stakes top 100 theatrical film, the inclusion numbers for women are vastly dramatically healthier. And this really confirms that the problem is not a deficit of talent, it's a deficit of opportunity at the highest budget.
Okay, give us the comparisons. How successful are women directors in other media?
In the world of episodic television, women are absolutely thriving. Women directed a robust 37% of television episodes in 2023 and 2020. That is almost 5 times the rate of top-grossing feature.
37%, that is an astonishing gap. What about streaming and independent cinema?
On the streaming side, which is often seen as that middle ground between TV and theatrical film, the source noted that women helmed 20% of Netflix recently, and in independent film, which is the entry point for so much talent, women direct significantly higher percentages of films, particularly in the U.S. dramatic competition at Sundance.
So, the proof of competence exists across the board. The question then is why this mass disparity between feature films at 8% and television at 37%. If women are directing 37% of TV episodes successfully, often complex, high production value episodes, why aren't they getting the blockbuster film job?
The source offers a really crucial analytical difference between them. Television directing is described as a vastly different undertaking than feature film directing. In TV, the director is often on the assembly.
And what does assembly line mean in this context?
It means the director's main job is to execute the established creative vision of the showrunner. The showrunner is the main creative authority. They're often the writer, executive producer. So the TV director is a highly skilled shepherd. They're focused on consistency, pacing, hitting marks within a tight budget and schedule that was already established by the showrunner.
So the TV director is executing the vision, not necessarily originating the entire creative and financial vision of a $200 million spec.
Exactly. TV directing is essential and highly skilled work, but the risk profile is dramatically lower per episode, and the creative liability falls primarily on the showrunner. Feature film directing, especially a blockbuster, makes the director the single point of failure and the primary creative risk bearer. Many talented women are succeeding brilliantly in TV, which should serve as an excellent training ground. But that success isn't translating into the big-budget feature film space because executives view the two jobs as being in fundamentally different risk environments.
So the expertise gained in TV, while valuable, it might not automatically be viewed by these ROI-obsessed executives as sufficient proof that a director can successfully command a massive theatrical budget and guarantee that critical return.
The problem is one of perception and trust, not one of competence. The TV success proves competence. The film failure proves the executive risk model is flawed or biased or both.
Let's break down the hiring patterns by distributor over the entire 19-year span. The source provides a scorecard on which major studios are leading and which are lagging in providing even those few opportunities.
Okay, looking across the 2007 to 2025 period, the quote-unquote leaders in hiring women directors were Universal Pictures at 9.4% and Walt Disney at 8%. And it's critical to note that even the industry leaders were barely reaching 10% representation over 2 decades. It just highlights how low the baseline has been historically.
So even the best are still performing abysmally by any real... Who are the laggards? The studios that hired the lowest percentage of women directors across that 19...
The 3 lowest percentage distributors across that span were Paramount at a shocking 2%, Lionsgate at 4.3%, and 20th Century Fox at 4.6%.
2%. Paramount at 2% over 19 years. That essentially makes it look like a conscious choice to exclude women from their top gross.
It raises very serious questions about the pipeline and the commitment within their executive structure. And interestingly, in this specific 2025 sample, the year of the recession, the existing leaders maintain their position. Walt Disney Studios catched 3 women directors to top-grossing film, and Universal Pictures attached 2. So in a down year, the major opportunity providers remained the same, but the overall quantity was just dramatically reduced.
That consistency of failure and limited opportunity brings us to our final section, conclusion, where we summarize the source's overall viewpoint, critique cycle, and the source includes a pretty strong perspective on what it calls the act trap.
It does. The source material argues that identity politics-based activism is structured in a way that makes reaching true parity, meaning, say, 50% men and 50% women directors, impossible to achieve under the current structure itself demands perpetual critique.
Why does the source suggest that parity can never be under this act?
Because the goalposts will always move. It's an ever-moving target. If the industry were to somehow hit 50% gender parity tomorrow, the activists, according to the source, would immediately shift the demand to ensure that parity is precisely divided by specific race and ethnicity percentage. They would demand the right amount of white female directors, the right amount of black female directors, the right amount of Latina directors, and so on and so on.
And if they ever achieved that specific, incredibly precise, intersectional demographic pair,
the source posits that they would simply find something else to complain about or create a new axis of identity to track, because the fundamental structure of this type of activism relies on the idea that there is always more work to do. If the ultimate goal total satisfactory demographic parity were ever reached, the activists are, in a sense, out of business. And this leads to this perpetual critique regardless of the actual numbers, which frustrates executives and leads to the kind of reactive hiring.
So the source ultimately pushes back against this cycle by reaffirming the preference for pure meritocracy.
Absolutely. It clearly reaffirms the preference for a meritocratic world where talent is hired because they have a bulletproof resume of proven success, rather than relying on systems that are perceived as leading to directors failing up. The ultimate aim, regardless of identity, should be that talent speaks for itself and financial success guarantees continued work.
Okay, let's distill this. What are the 3 key takeaways we should leave the learner with after this deep dive into the USC Annenberg 2025?
First, the drop in 2025 was catastrophic. It reversed years of attempts at inclusion, sinking to a 2008 level low of 8.1% of top-grossing film directors being women. The progress was fragile and it was fleeting.
Second, the cause of this decline is critical. It's due to high-level executive decision-making. This was a corporate choice made during the greenlighting process, long before any recent political or DEI probe effect. Hollywood decided collectively to revert to old hiring habits.
And third, critical success, even for women of color who earn the highest Metacritic scores, does not guarantee feature film opportunity. The executive priority is strictly box office results and a guaranteed return on investment. That is the single factor governing multi-million-dollar feature film hiring. Quality, tragically, is secondary to financial predictability.
Which brings us back to the most compelling contradiction in all this data. We know women are successfully directing 37% of high-profile, profitable television episodes. That track record is definitive proof of high competence, organizational skill, and professional vetting.
The talent is not the issue. The resume is indeed bulletproof in one meeting.
So the question isn't, can women direct? The data says yes, absolutely. The question is, why is Hollywood's risk calculator only flagging gender when the budget crosses $100 million?
And that's the provocative closing thought for the studios, isn't it? If the resume is definitively bulletproof in the high-volume professional environment of television, what specific, quantifiable structural or financial risks inherent only in multi-million-dollar theatrical production prevent Hollywood executives from trusting those proven TV directors with the biggest budget? The answer isn't in the talent pool. It's in the executive suite's outdated and biased risk assessment model. And that structural difference is the last barrier that needs to be broken.